Hi there, my name is Bernadette Hunt. I'm the Vice President of Southland Federated Farmers. I'm also a passionate Southland farmer. I farm with my husband on a 650 hectare farming operation, sheep, beef and a bit of dairy grazing and arable cropping on properties just near Gore in Southland. The reason I'm doing this presentation is to help bust a few myths about intensive winter grazing. Every year we see negative comments and media headlines about the winter grazing practices, and it cuts pretty deep actually to hear some of those negative comments. If you step back for a minute, I think most people understand and agree that apart from the odd bad egg, the primary focus of farmers is to take really good care of their stock and their land. They do farming because they love it. There's way better ways to make money, so it's clearly not all about the profit. So yeah, farmers are heavily focused on working with their stock and their land and doing that really well. Yet for some reason, every year when winter hits and bad photos like this one appear, many people forget all of that and assume that all of Southland farmers are bad eggs, and that's just not the case. Clearly, winter grazing practices aren't well understood. So that's why I'm putting myself out there a bit to share some information to try and bust some of those myths. So, and just bear with me, I am going to read from notes because there's some things I really want to make sure that I don't miss getting across to you, and I don't want to end up waffling too much. So what's the big deal about intensive winter grazing? In a nutshell, photos like these two are the big deal. These show the same paddock, the same mob, 10 minutes apart. There's absolutely no photo doctoring except a wee bit of cropping so that they'd both fit on the page. I took them in seconds. One makes the paddock look pretty average, this one here, and in this one looks fine. When you see published photos in the media, they've actually been taken for a purpose, often by a photographer who can and does polish them and works with angles to tell the story that they want to portray. The cattle help out by being naturally nosy, especially because people usually feed them. So if you stand by a puddle or a muddy corner, the cows will come to you and pose while you take a photo. And that's how we end up with photos that look terrible in a paddock that might have absolutely nothing wrong with it. So what is winter grazing? It's the grazing of stock on forage crops over winter. In Southland winters, there is next to no grass growth. What does grow, or what is left before winter, is really poor quality because of our string of frosts, freezing conditions and lack of sunshine hours. So even if you've got loads of grass, it doesn't maintain stock condition. They'll lose weight on it because it's poor quality. As well as that, everything gets really waterlogged. So outside of northern Southland and some river flats, heavy animals will turn any paddock at all to mud in a day or two throughout much of the winter. In fact, if you walk across the same stretch of your lawn every day during the winter, even just for a week, you'll make mud. So heavy cows or lots and lots of sheep or anything like that are going to make mud wherever they're put. Brassicas and fodder beet, so chow, kale and swedes and fodder beet, we grow those crops because they retain their condition in the poor weather. We use the growing season, we plant these crops in the spring and they grow through the summer and the autumn into a really high yielding crop and a good quality feed that will hold its condition through the winter, not get damaged by the frosts, and they can provide lots of feed on a smaller area, much more than grass can. So that lets us limit the amount of area that gets damaged in the poor weather. We can feed a larger number of stock on a smaller area with these crops than we can if we were feeding them grass. So that means that most of the farm doesn't get damaged. At the start of winter, we measure the crop and so that we can be sure about how much we're feeding to the stock every day. We know how much they need to eat on a daily basis, so we measure the crop to know exactly how much we're giving them every day. They're given a measured amount of that feed in a controlled way with using fences and some supplementary feed like baleage. So we harvest grass when it's in good condition and wrap it up in bales or turn it into hay and feed that to them in the winter alongside the crop so that they've got a good balanced diet. So good wintering looks really different from one farm to the next. Different farms have different conditions and different things to think about, different stock, all of that kind of thing. So it doesn't look the same everywhere, but everywhere it does look to balance animal health, environmental impact, regulatory compliance, protection of the soil, and it has to fit into this overall farming system and be cost effective for the stock owner and for the person who's grazing the stock. Huge amount of thought and planning goes into it. Poor wintering comes at a big cost, both to the environment, the stock and the farmer, and nobody actually sets out to achieve that kind of a result. But the sun doesn't always shine. I don't think anyone would have a problem with the photos that I've shown you to date, but the sun doesn't always shine. This looks really, really awesome. This, not so much. Same paddock after a bit of rain. Same with this. Looks lovely. This, just because it's rained a wee bit. Or this was a photo that was actually supplied by SAFE and produced in the media as an example of terrible wintering and miserable cows. Look at it. It actually looks fantastic. Bit of rain, yeah, it's a bit muddy, bit wet. Nothing has changed in any of these photos except that it has rained. It doesn't take much rain to create puddles, but when the sun comes out, it dries out again pretty quickly in many situations. Sure, doesn't look as pretty, absolutely agree with you. Are we suddenly maltreating the stock though? Absolutely not. They're still really well fed. In fact, often farmers will feed more to the stock in poor weather than they do in the good weather because they waste more in the poor weather and they're colder, therefore they need more to eat. So they still have full bellies, and when there's no people standing there to attract them to the puddles, they go off to the drier parts of the paddock and sit down to chew their cud if they want to. Sure, it's not as pleasant. We don't like standing outside in the rain either, but they're absolutely not being maltreated. So to give you a wee bit more insight, this is our place near Gore. We're just a normal operation. We try to do it right. We're continually looking for ways to improve, but we've got high debt and we can't just throw money at everything we'd like to, just like most farmers. So we're a mixed farming operation. We do beef and sheep and some dairy grazing and grow quite a lot of crops. We moved here 13 years ago, took over the farm in April with the winter crop already established. In our mind, and same with most people at that time, the focus of winter grazing was to ensure that animals were fully fed and maintained their condition over the winter. We fed the animals well every day, got them to the end of winter, tick, job done. A few years later, new freshwater legislation started to gain prominence and the focus of the conversation shifted more to the environment. So now the attitude is very different. Everyone knows that winter grazing brings risks to the environment and there are things that we can and should do to mitigate those risks. But the first focus of winter grazing never went away. Look after the animals, get them through the winter in the best possible condition. The focus of the conversation shifted to the environment, but the focus on animals was always and still is the foundation of intensive winter grazing and why we do it. What's now in the foreground of the conversation was shifted a bit is sentience, so how the animals are feeling. So it's not just about, they're not happy just because they're well fed. We're starting to think about the other things that are important to animals. Farmers were shocked to be accused of not looking after the animals, but there's now lots of focus on those other aspects other than just making sure that they're well fed. Like with anything, some people are making those shifts more quickly with others and some will need more encouragement than others, but the shift is absolutely happening. Obviously, there are some days that are less than ideal and we can't stop the stock from getting wet, but we can make sure they're well equipped to withstand it. So what does go on behind winter grazing? The process begins with paddock selection. Winter crops are part of a much bigger farming system, with the crops forming part of a rotation to enable the renewal of grass while managing pests. If we just leave grass in the paddock and never ever upgrade it, it won't keep producing good quality grass. So we need to turn that over, put in fresh seed, grow fresh plants so that we have good quality grass. And it's really, really helpful to, in between those different crops of grass, put something else in between to help us mitigate pests. Just the same as if you're a veggie gardener, you tend to move things around in your garden. You won't not put potatoes in the same place year after year after year. People generally know about not putting brassicas in the same place year after year after year. It harbours disease and reduces quality. So it's exactly the same with grass. Many farms, ours included, don't have nice flat paddocks with no waterways, but our stock still have to be fed in the winter. 13 years ago, when we first started here, paddock selection was almost entirely based on the grass rotation. Which paddock needed the next new grass? That's where we'll put the winter crop. Now we consider much more. We can't avoid slope, but where the risks associated with slope can't be managed well, things like the soil travelling down the hill, we won't opt to put winter crop there anymore. We might put a summer crop in instead that's less likely to get so wet, or do it a different way, and a lot of people are doing the same thing. And right from the time the paddocks are sprayed out, we make decisions about how to manage the paddock. So in these two photos, you can see that we left grass, rank grass in the critical source area. This is where the water flows in a rainfall event. We've left the grass there and same right through the middle of here. So it's basically in the valley between the two slopes. We've left it in rank grass. And that captures, if there's high rainfall and water's running off and travelling this way, that long grass helps. It's a filter. So why do we select paddocks that are on slopes or on heavier soil? Why don't we just graze everything on those light or stonier soils? The term physiographics is well understood in Southland. It's a science that indicates the risk to water quality from a specific area of land. What you can't see from photos or from the side of the road is that we're on a physiographic type that is most suited to winter grazing. Underneath our soils, there's lignite or coal below the surface, which means that nitrates are far less likely to leach to waterways. So if the water goes down, it's stopped in that lignite layer, and to put it really simply, the nitrates don't travel on past the lignite, so they don't get to waterways. These kind of losses are really hard to avoid on other areas, but our geology does it for us. A block that we lease down the road a wee bit might be seen from the outside as more suitable for winter grazing. It's nice and flat, stony below the surface so it doesn't get deep mud. It's much more pleasant for winter grazing for the staff, the stock, and for anyone looking at it. But we know there is much more significant nitrate challenge from wintering on that land. When nitrates go down below the root zone, off they go to the groundwater and into the waterways. There's very little we can do about it. So the risk to water on our rolling farmland is sediment loss. So on this slope it's the risk of soil travelling down the hill and making its way to water. We can mitigate that much more effectively, just like you can see here with the rank grass that will capture it. So a key message is don't judge a book by its cover. Most farmers know their land very well and are doing their best to work within its limitations and mitigate the risks. That might not be easy to see from a roadside or from a photo, and it's very difficult to regulate for by creating blanket rules that say farmers can do this or can't do that. But farmers work with what they know about their land, and that's usually very, very extensive knowledge, and do the best they can. So we're stuck with our slopes. How do we mitigate the risks? Buffers to waterways are the most obvious example, and they're a critical step and are pretty much automatic now. So where you've got a waterway adjacent to where you're grazing stock or cropping, keeping a buffer strip where the stock don't graze adjacent to the waterway is an easy and sensible step to take, and most people do that anyway now. Critical source area was a term that was unheard of when we first took on our place and started winter grazing. And for those of you that I mentioned it before, the critical source area is this area through the bottom where the water travels down the hills and then flows through that low point. Protecting those is commonplace now. So in this particular paddock here, it's reasonably steep. We fenced off that strip. It's a 5 metre strip there. It doesn't look it from here, but it's a 5 metre strip right through the bottom, and it's actually wider at this end and at this end where it's wetter to filter the sediment. In another paddock, we knew that grazing would be really hard to manage with a fenced off critical source area, but we ensured that the next paddock, so the water would flow through the crop paddock and into another paddock, and that had rank grass in it, so the outflowing water would make its way through that rank grass in the next paddock before it exited our property. Same outcome, different method. Straw at the outflow point, so you quite often see people put bales of straw into that point, so down here, so the water will flow through here and out this end of the paddock where you can't see, and people can put bales of straw here, which again is another filtration system. Grazing direction is also a consideration with potential to significantly improve outcomes, but it's also oversimplified. You might have heard about people who are supposed to graze from the top of the slope to the bottom of the slope. This paddock here shows an example of why that's challenging. We quite often have multiple mobs. So in this paddock we actually had 4 mobs. You can see one here, one here, one here, and there's one over this side as well. 4 different mobs of cattle grazing in different directions. And multiple tops of slopes as well. So the water flow direction is this way. It leaves our property down here, but obviously there's a slope down here, and actually up here it drops off down the other side as well. So which way is top to bottom? In our mind, top to bottom is the direction of the water flow. So that's the direction we've grazed. If you think about grazing down the hill, if we put the fences this way and the cattle are coming down the hill, you can probably visualise what would happen to the mud or the dirt as they come down. They basically end up pushing it down on top of the crop, and it's not very comfortable or easy for the stock to be facing downhill while they eat the crop, which is what it forces them to do. So leaving a strip at the bottom achieves exactly the same thing. The reason you would graze top to bottom is because there's always crop left in front of the stock to filter any sediment and help stop it from flowing down the hill. Leaving a strip at the bottom achieves exactly the same purpose. It's way easier for us to manage, results in less soil movement, less damage to the paddock, better use of feed, and certainly much happier stock. And so you might see people grazing, across the hill instead of down it. It doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. They're probably putting in other mitigations to prevent the sediment runoff. Location of water troughs, where the shelter is, direction of the weather, matching of stock class to the paddock, the method of cultivation and the direction that we cultivate, they're all things that we manipulate to mitigate the loss of sediment off these crop paddocks. Back fencing. One big concern is the discussion that is going on at the moment, really started last year, about dry laying areas. And the question, what is dry? Definitely stock needs somewhere firmish. They won't lie down in a puddle, but they'll happily lie down on firmish mud. They won't lie down anywhere if they're hungry. So back fencing poses an interesting challenge. Back fencing basically is where the stock are eating here now, where you'd put a fence across behind them so that they can't walk back onto the areas of the paddock that are previously eaten. It's to stop them traipsing up and down this area. You put a fence on here and make sure that they've only got access to what they have today and maybe a little bit extra for some space to move around. It's a really interesting challenge, back fencing. In this case, environmental and animal welfare regulations can contradict each other. So you can see in this photo, if you look closely, that the stock have come way back from their feed to choose the spot they lie down. Can you see those spots up here by the fence line? That's where they've been laying during the night. So they've come a long way back. If we put a back fence here, they can't choose where they want to sit down. The reason they've come up to here is there's a big shelter out up here. There's also the hills, so it's in lieu of the wind. It's obviously been an area that they've felt warm and comfortable in. That's where they've chosen to go. If they'd been back fenced, they couldn't have done that. And actually, some of the tight back fencing has resulted in some of the photos that people didn't like last year, like that very first one that I had on my cover page when I started this presentation. They haven't got the room to move back to other drier areas of the paddock to lie down. Sometimes back fencing absolutely makes sense. If it's got really wet and sloppy and you've had a bad weather event or whatever, fencing that off so the cows stay off that wet bit and are only on the dry area 100% makes sense. But it doesn't work in all situations. You can see this paddock, it looks nice and dry. They're not traipsing through deep mud or puddles or anything up here. Why not let them have that spot to lie down? The point is we need to let farmers make the right decisions. Having a blanket rule that you must back fence stops us being able to achieve the best animal welfare outcomes. So here's another key message. We, as in farmers, have both MPI from an animal welfare perspective and the Regional Council from an environmental perspective on our case. So we have to weigh up both animal welfare and the environment. The regulators and some of the groups that are trying to come up with recommendations and things like that have the luxury of focusing on just one or the other, not both. And as a result, they often come up with oversimplified solutions and rules. Farmers need to weigh them both up, need to let them do that as effectively as possible. Just a couple more back fencing photos here. So you can see that it's muddy, but it's firm. It's not sloppy and puddly. And look, this is where they've been laying. And here as well, it's these two are the same paddock. You can see here's their crop face. They've come right back to here because it's more sheltered. This is where they want to lie down. They're not going to wander back here for no reason, and it's firm. They're not traipsing through sloppy wet mud. It's nice and firm, and they're quite happy laying down in these places. If I back fence them way back here, they wouldn't have the choice. And here's another one. Look at these cows laying down. They've got the space to get back a bit and find the nice dry spots that they want to lie on. So Plan B is another conversation that comes up a lot, and I actually have heard a little bit about this. It's to do with what we do with our stock when an adverse weather event comes. Many people assume that we do or should take the stock off the crop when the weather turns bad, and actually I've heard quite a lot of talk and comments about feeding the stock each day and then shifting them off the crop to somewhere dry overnight. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and here's some food for thought. If you've set the paddock up really well, there's plenty of feed available. The feed is a type of feed that stands up out of the snow, unlike grass. So you can see this, the Swedes stand up out of the snow, as opposed to these grass paddocks in the background, which you can't see that well, but basically those grass paddocks, there's no feed for them to access because it's buried in the snow. Swedes and chow and things stand up out of the snow a bit. You've got the ability to increase the feed you give to the cattle in poor condition or the sheep. The location of the paddock is suitable to allow them to cope with bad weather, and you've protected the paddock from sediment loss. Why would you move them off in a bad weather event? In all honesty, the only reason you would move them off that paddock in a bad weather event is because it might make those who don't understand feel better. In most cases, it's absolutely not better for the stock or the environment to do that. We've set this paddock up for winter. We know what winter's going to bring us, to a large extent. Okay, some years worse than others, but we expect bad weather in the winter. That's why we do this. Think for a few things. How would you move them out of one paddock to another, given they know that this is where they're fed? Right? So they don't want to move away from their feed. They're not easy to get to move out of a winter crop paddock. In many cases, you actually need dogs to do that. And would you be comfortable seeing us using dogs to chase cattle through a muddy paddock to get them out? Probably not. There's extra soil damage because you're making the stock move through the eaten area more. The gateways, the mud that it creates in gateways, if you're moving their stock in and out at the same gateway every single day, it gets unbelievably muddy through that gateway. It causes lameness problems. The more you make these animals move in these conditions, the more lameness they get. Plus, there's an impact on that next paddock. So you're now damaging another paddock, by moving them into that. And you've got to think about how you'll feed out in that paddock. You haven't got a nice crop here. You're moving them to a grass paddock, so you've got to be able to get, we know the grass isn't good quality, so you've got to be able to get the food to them. The list goes on and on. Our usual practice is to plan really well so that they'll be well looked after on that paddock in bad weather. We'll feed out more and we'll feed more often without having to take a tractor out of the shed, which causes more damage. And actually there's been some publicity down here this week about complaints about mud on roads from tractors. If we leave them in this paddock, we don't even have to use a tractor because it's all set up and it's all ready to go for them. Shelter's another really interesting conversation too. There's a big difference between exposed paddocks and sheltered paddocks, and it's not all about trees, and I pointed out the shelter from the slope and that kind of stuff. If our stock are wintering on a paddock that's particularly exposed to the bad weather, we do make sure we've got an alternative plan for them. But in most cases, we set the paddock up for the bad weather, which we know we're going to get. This is very much horses for courses and dependent on the farm, the paddock, the specific stock, and the season. I completely agree, some people need to prepare better for the bad weather, and this is a big area of focus, but please don't look at stock on a winter crop paddock during a bad weather event and assume that the farmer is a bad egg. Most of us work our butts off in those weather events to ensure that the stock are really well equipped to withstand it. They've got nice thick leather coats and they've got a massive engine inside them that, as long as it's working away digesting food, and they've, that belly's full, they really are well equipped to withstand poor weather conditions. This is another common, I'm nearly done now. This is another really common question. Why don't you just put them all in a shed? So we've got a small wintering shed and we absolutely love it. Ask my husband what he'd improve about ours and he'd tell you he'd make it twice the size. It's a brilliant way to winter stock, and huge numbers of them have gone up around Southland over the last few years. But make no mistake, they bring their own perception problems. And actually, some of our market contracts, so our contracts to supply these stock into beef contracts in other parts of the world, don't allow us to use sheds because of the grass-fed story, even though we feed grass baleage to the stock that are in the shed. We make a promise in some of our market contracts, not we personally, but our processors make promises in some of the contracts that these animals have spent their entire life frolicking around on nice grass paddocks, and so if we put them in a shed, we're not allowed to sell them to those contracts, which is another, don't even get me started on that. In addition to that, sheds require huge capital outlay, and actually sometimes the huge capital investment required to put up a shed means that the farmer has to intensify to be able to afford it, i.e. they need to have more stock producing more milk or meat to be able to afford the shed. Is that what you want from putting up a shed? That's not really the intention, so it kind of defeats the purpose. They also bring an emissions impact because you've got to bring the food to the animals instead of them being out there where they're eating it. And there is absolutely no doubt that more use of sheds would just shift attention to those poor cows locked inside in unnatural conditions. We don't have free range, we like free range chooks, and we don't like sow farrowing crates, yet we suddenly want to put all our cows in a shed. make no mistake, there'd be a shift in perceptions and a shift in the complaints if we shifted entirely to that. Just like winter cropping, if sheds aren't managed well, the outcomes can be really bad. So I guess the message there is they're not a simple panacea to this issue. Some people are putting them up and they're working really well, but we can't just say ban all outdoor winter grazing, put everything inside. That's not going to be the solution that people really think it will be. So to sum up, farmers in Southland are the same as farmers everywhere, busting their butts to look after their stock and their land and maintain some sort of lifestyle and a little bit of profit along the way. Please don't lose sight of that when you drive past a paddock and don't think it looks great. Having said that, we absolutely have a perception problem, and the vast majority of New Zealanders don't understand what it is we're doing or have access to information like I've just shared with you. And in fact, many of them don't want it. We can't change our climate, we can't stop wet weather in winter, we can't all put up barns, and we can't stop farming just because it's winter time. Winter crop grazing is an essential part of farming in parts of this country, and I hope that what I've shared with you has helped you understand that there is much, much more to the practice than meets the eye, and that the whole focus is making sure that the animals are really well looked after to get through this time of year, which just is tough. Thanks very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And feel free to contact anyone from any industry group at Federated Farmers, Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb if you want more information or have some questions. Thanks again.